We've looked in the past at the Klingon Mek'leth from Star Trek, and we've analysed whether it's a good weapon, a bad weapon, how it might have been used, how you could use it most effectively. Now we're going to look at the Mek'leth. Hi folks, Matt Easton here, Schola Gladiatoria and Easton Antique Arms. I teach people sword fighting and I deal in antique weapons for a living. So I analyse historical weapons and ethnographic weapons from around the world, from all across history. And occasionally I get asked about science fiction and fantasy weapons as well, and of course many of these have for their inspiration real-world historical weapons, and the Mek'leth, which we're going to be looking at in this video, is no exception. That also has historical basis as well. And as mentioned, we have looked at its more famous cousin, the Mek'leth, in previous videos, so I will put a link to those below, so be sure to check those videos out as well. But here we're looking at the Mek'leth specifically, and I was asked a lot after doing the Mek'leth videos to look at the Mek'leth, and I have to say I actually relished that opportunity. It's been quite a long time, I'm finally getting around to it, because in many ways we could argue that the Mek'leth is a more practical and better weapon. So in this video we're going to look at some official background, canon background to what the Mek'leth is. Is it better or worse than a Mek'leth? What advantages, disadvantages does it have? What's its historical basis? So what parallels does it have in the real world? And finally, I'm going to give a relatively brief review of it. What do I think of it as a weapon design? But very briefly before we go on, I want to mention that this video is sponsored very kindly by Star Trek Fleet Command. Star Trek Fleet Command is an open world MMO strategy game that's free to download. In it you get to command a starbase with starships on the frontier of space. You can construct and upgrade all of your favourite ships from the Star Trek franchise, as well as recruiting some very famous characters that you'll all know. You can secure and then expand your territory, fight off enemies. You can build alliances, gain resources and explore new worlds. The exciting news is the Borg are back in Star Trek Fleet Command now. It's completely free to download and you can play it on iOS, Android and Windows. In fact, you can download it right now using my link below here or the QR code on screen. Now, as mentioned, for January, one of the exciting things is that the Borg are back, and there are brand new missions inspired by their appearances in Star Trek The Next Generation. Fan favourite Hugh the Borg is back, and you can help him defend the collective from a scientist's quest for revenge. You can save an eager Pakled from the Borg and his quest to try and get assimilated by them on purpose. And in the game, you've got an AI assistant called Maya, and the Borg are even going to try and assimilate her, so you've got to defend her in the game as well. Now, another new feature to Star Trek Fleet Command is Fleet Commanders. In this you can select really famous characters from the Star Trek franchise and you can put them in command of overall strategy for their sectors. This increases their starbase's effectiveness and power in your game. Fleet Commanders starts with 3 legendary choices, either Admiral James T. Kirk, Captain Spock or Locutus of Borg. You can build the Command Center, which is a brand new starbase location from which to control your Starfleet commanders. So give it a go now. You can use my link below or the QR codes right on screen in front of your eyes there, and you can get playing for absolutely free now. Remember, it works on iOS, Windows and Android. Free to download, free to play. Go and start building your fleet. So thanks for sticking with me. Now let's get back to the main content of this video. Now, the Mek'leth's design is actually quite interesting, and it's strongly connected to Michael Dorn himself, Worf. When he joined the crew of Deep Space Nine in 1995, he requested a special new weapon from the weapons creator Dan Curry. Now, Dan Curry had previously designed the Mek'leth, which was inspired by certain types of Chinese crescent sword. So Worf, Michael Dorn, requested that he have a shorter, smaller, more easily carryable, more concealable weapon, and this became the Mek'leth. In the official canon, the Mek'leth is supposedly made of Barkanite, very, very strong type of metal, and has Targ hide wrapped around the grip. As well as being smaller and more concealable, another very important aspect of the design in the official canon lore is that it has this hooked element to the front guard. We'll talk more about the practicalities of that a little bit later in the video, and this hook is supposedly supposed to engage, nullify, and possibly even break bat'leths that it comes up against. In canon, T'Pol described the Mek'leth as a two-pronged dagger that could be used to disembowel people or cut their throats, and also to be thrown. And Jadzia Dax opined that while she liked the Mek'leth and it had some advantages, overall she preferred the reach that the bat'leth offered. Now in Star Trek Discovery, in fact, the Mek'leth was shown completely differently, and we're not going to look at that in this video. We're just going to look at the more classic designs, because obviously they changed a lot of the designs, including just of Klingons, in Discovery. So fundamental question, do I consider the Mek'leth, based on what we can see in the various Star Trek series with the classic design of Mek'leth, is it a better weapon, is it a more practical weapon than the bat'leth? In short, because I know you won't want me to beat around the bush too much, I think yes, with a caveat. So I concluded in my previous videos on the bat'leth that I actually consider it's not a bad weapon for armoured combat. Now, Klingons do wear armour. They're shown wearing armour in the various different versions of Star Trek, even the earliest ones. And so I kind of think of the bat'leth as a specialised armoured fighting weapon. Yes, it's quite heavy, it's not particularly long, it doesn't give any real great advantages over, let's say, a big knife or a normal sword in one-on-one combat, and certainly not as advantageous as a pole weapon. So I argued that you need to make the thrusting points more effective. You need to make the overall size of the weapon bigger, because really for the weight of it, it's really quite a small weapon. Make it a bit bigger, make it a bit pointier or straighter at the ends, and it would actually then be a really good armoured fighting weapon. So if we assume that the bat'leth is best optimised to fighting in armour, I think in a way the Mek'leth makes more sense for fighting out of armour, although it could maybe be a not too bad weapon for fighting in armour, depending on the type of armour involved. And we'll talk more about some real world parallels to that weapon in a second. So overall, I think they're different weapons for different purposes. One-on-one, I think the Mek'leth actually has a lot of advantages. Being a little bit lighter, a little bit quicker. It is going to have a reach advantage in a way, but the bat'leth is actually not particularly long, and actually if you hold the bat'leth one-handed, it's very unwieldy, and if you're holding it two-handed, you don't have very long reach, whereas the Mek'leth can be held at arm's extension, which gives you quite a long reach. So when you're talking about reach of a weapon, it's the same thing with two-handed swords and one-handed swords. Don't always look at the literal length of the weapon, you've got to consider how is it held, and as soon as you hold something with two hands, you bring your body square on and you sort of shorten your reach. If you can hold something with one hand, you can stretch that one hand out far to one side. So something like a one-handed sword, like a rapier or a sabre, actually has quite considerable reach because you're only holding it with one hand. And the same goes for the Mek'leth. So actually in most applications for most people most of the time, I would say that the Mek'leth is a far more practical weapon, even aside from carrying it and concealability and things like that, which we'll touch on in a second. I think it's a more practical weapon for most scenarios than the bat'leth is. Now let's talk about the historical inspiration or real world equivalents to the Mek'leth. So first of all, it was designed theoretically by Dan Curry based on the Nepalese Kora. Now the Kora is a type of sword from Nepal, just north of India in the Himalayas. And I can see that. I can see how the blade for the Mek'leth comes from that. However, it should be noted that the Kora usually has really quite a different shaped blade. I should also mention the kukri. So here is a Kailash Blades kukri, very, very nice example. And you'll notice that the forward curves of the blade is obviously similar both to the Kora and to the Mek'leth in this situation. And so it has some of the same considerations. We'll talk about that blade in a second. So I would say that collectively the Kora, which has a very different type of hilt, we'll talk about the hilt in a second, the Kora and the other Nepalese knife, the kukri, have parallels with the Mek'leth, and that's certainly, we know for a fact that the Kora is one of the inspirations for it. But there are other knives as well. So the Ginunting, for example, from the Philippines, a type of forwards curving blade. It's more pointy, it's got some differences, but again, it's a similar idea. It's a forwards curving blade. We can also say, as far as the blades are concerned, there's even some parallels with certain types of African sword and throwing knives specifically. So African throwing knives, as they're called, which can be used as hand weapons, usually together with a shield, but they can be used without a shield. They have maybe some parallels as well. And this kind of squared off blunt end that we see on the Mek'leth is actually something that you see on various ethnographic weapons from around the world. But none of these have an element which is really, really intrinsic to the Mek'leth, and that's the handguard. Therefore, I actually consider that another thing which, intentionally or accidentally, I think it was probably accidentally, which there's a real world parallel for the Mek'leth is the Dusak. Now, I don't own a Dusak, but I do own an earlier ancestor of it, the Langmesser here. And you'll notice that the Langmesser has a type of handguard. But if we actually look at the Dusak, particularly the practice ones, but even some real world ones, you'll notice that some of them are essentially made of one piece of metal, or the practice ones were possibly wood or wood and leather, with a cutout for the hand. And actually, aesthetically, these have some parallels in appearance with the Mek'leth. So actually, I would say, if we're looking at real world historical weapons that have a parallel with the Klingon Mek'leth, we need to look at Nepalese swords and knives, we need to look at maybe some African swords and knives, and also European Renaissance as well, particularly things with handguards, and really we're talking about Langmesser and Dusaks. So in short, do I think that the Mek'leth is a decent design of weapon? Do I think that it would work well as a weapon in the real world? Well, the summary is, yeah, it'd be okay. I'd make some changes to it, but we'll look at those here. So fundamentally, let's break these down into the three parts. I'm going to look at the blade, I'm going to look at the grip, and I'm going to look at the guard. And obviously all of those three things are attached and they interact. So first of all, the blade. Well, as we've seen, the blade is fundamentally kind of similar to a Nepalese kura. A little bit of trivia, by the way, for the Star Wars fans out there, you can see Nepalese kura being used by Gamorrean guards in the Boba Fett series, Book of Boba Fett. So the Nepalese kura has been an inspiration both for Star Wars and Star Trek. But fundamentally, there's nothing wrong with that blade. Yes, it's got a sort of blunted end, but so do lots of ethnographic blades. I've talked about that in the past, and in some ways that makes it similar to a hatchet. It means that your mass distribution is up towards the end. It means you're going to have more chopping potential right at the tip, which if you make a blade thin and pointy, it never chops that well near the tip. So it's put all of that concentration of mass up towards the tip. You can still stab into fleshy targets with it, so it's still got some stabbing potential, but fundamentally you have a forward-weighted choppy blade. In addition to that, you also have a curved blade. Now, curved blades have certain advantages. Theoretically, you can do hooking types of attack and defense with them, but more importantly, perhaps, when you chop with them, they meet in front of the line of axis, and in that sense, it makes them a little bit like a hatchet. It gives them extra chopping power. So it makes them very, very formidable choppers. Also because when they meet the target, they meet it at an angle. Now, many of you will have heard that curved swords cut better than straight swords. Not always true, that's an oversimplification. But fundamentally, if you're meeting something perpendicular, it means that the gradient is straight up the hill. So if you imagine walking straight up a hill, everyone knows it's easier to walk diagonally up a hill. So if we change the angle to that, it means you're meeting the edge is meeting the target at a slanted angle, and therefore the gradient, in other words, the angle of the edge bevel, is reduced, halved if it's 45 degrees. So quite simply, a kukri, yes, it could be, if you met it that way, it would be backwards curved, but if you meet it that way, it would be forwards curved. So meeting the target at an angle gives you a chopping and slicing benefit. And in addition, we've got the push and pull effect as well, which could be used even if you just lay the blade on target and pull, it will have a really effective slicing effect. So fundamentally, the type of blade that we see on the Mek'leth, you can actually see on various different types of historical knife and sword from Africa, from Europe, from Asia, Southeast Asia and North Asia. And these are blade types that absolutely do work effectively. So I have no issues with the Mek'leth blade design at all. Now coming on to the grip, this is where I have a point of criticism, and I shout out here to Scalagrim because I know that Scalagrim hit on this exact same point. When he was reviewing the Mek'leth about 8 years ago, I found his video. I'd never seen it before, but I've noticed it on the internet. So he'd been asked the same question, and I think we cover some of the same points, but I've looked a little bit more at the historical and ethnographic weapon comparisons. But the grip. One of the fundamental problems with the design of the Mek'leth as it's usually featured in Deep Space Nine and so on and so forth is that the grip it looks really like homemade. Okay, they could have done something better with the grip, and as Scal points out, especially in a kind of, you know, space generation kind of universe, people would have access to all sorts of materials. They could have made a really funky grip. Instead, they've just wrapped it in hide. Now, in defense of the Klingons are traditionalists, okay? So my riposte would be, yes, but there's lots of things that the Klingons do which aren't logical. They just do them because that's what we Klingons do. We do it this way. A Mek'leth is shaped like this because it's shaped like the antlers of a blah blah. And we wrap the grip in this way because we're supposed to use the hide of a certain creature. You know, this is all about tradition. And we shouldn't dismiss that. We shouldn't throw that out of the window. That's very important for world building in science fiction and fantasy. But moreover, it completely ties in with the Klingons as people. The fact that they're using these archaic weapons is anachronistic by its very nature. So the fact that the weapons are made in an archaic way, because that's the way they did it 100 generations or 2,000 generations ago, completely ties in with the Klingons. So, as a weapon, yes, I have exactly the same criticism as Scal, that the grip is just poorly done when it's just wrapped in hide like that. And their ancestors, the Klingon ancestors, probably would have done something like this nice kukri hilt made of horn, or, you know, wood, carved wood, or whatever. However, given that at some point in the past they did make them like that, if we just accept that that's the case, then it does make sense that they would still make them like that now. The next aspect of the Mek'leth design, which I'm actually a big fan of, again with a caveat, is the guard. Absolutely, it's useful having a handguard, and we notice there's a consistency. If we look at the Mek'leth, it has a handguard. If we look at the Mek'leth, it has a handguard. So I like the consistency of design between the Mek'leth and the Mek'leth. They look like they're from the same civilization, the Klingons. So I like that. But also mechanically, handguards are a really good thing. They became popular, really, they started to become popular in the late 15th century. They become very popular in the 16th century, and most swords in Europe have had handguards ever since. Start off usually with a knuckle bow, sometimes a side projection, this is called a nagel, and things like that. The Mek'leth just has a knuckle bow, but a knuckle bow, particularly for a short sword, is one of the most useful types of handguard you can possibly have. And we still have them on military sabres that are used in parade use, but they're still the patterns that were used in war in the 19th century, still today. Moreover, there's another detail about the handguards and the guard design, in fact, the overall hilt design on the Mek'leth, that I really like. That is that the guard is edged. That forward curving spike at the front of the guard is edged and pointed, and the pommel is edged and pointed. How's this useful? Quite simply, in offence and in defence. So we know that that hooked kind of quillon or guard, we could call it like that, at the front of the Mek'leth is supposedly used for hooking or parrying or blocking, locking, binding against an opponent's weapon. There's some statement about it being able to break a Mek'leth. I think that's mechanically unlikely, but I can understand why people would say that. And we have the same thing in our world when people talk about daggers used with rapiers that are described as sword breakers, and really they're there to actually block and lock and control an opponent's weapon, not so much to break it. But I love they've included that in the design, having a spiky pommel that you can hit people with. It's a technique that happens a lot with these types of swords, and having a guard that's offensive and defensive. A brilliant piece of design, I have no problem with it. I only really have one possible, relatively minor criticism with the design of the hilt, apart from that grip that we've talked about overall with the Mek'leth, and that is that if you look at where the mass is distributed on the weapon, obviously we've got mass in the blade, and then we have an awful lot of mass just in front of the hand, and quite a lot of mass on the knuckle bow around here on the Mek'leth. But then there's very little at the back. What you actually find in history is a lot of swords and knives. They actually have some degree of swelling at the back. Number one, to keep your hand in place, but also to give a degree of balance. And now normally with a straight blade like this, it's not so much of a problem. This doesn't have much of a pommel, it just swells out at the end of the wooden grip. But we have something here called distal taper. That is, the blade starts thick here and it gradually gets thinner and thinner towards the tip. And in addition, it tapers this way. The problem with the Mek'leth is you've got a double whammy. First of all, it's a forward curving blade that gets broader towards the end as it curves forward. But in addition, you've got a very heavy guard and you've got this kind of concentration of mass just in front of the hand. That does mean that if you make a good replica of this, it is going to be very, very choppy and have relatively poor balance and balance fairly far forward. However, is that important? Well, it might be with a longer sword, but with the Mek'leth, I actually think not so much, because with short swords, like a machete for example, that are designed for chopping, you can actually get away with that. And fundamentally, if we look at something like this tomahawk here from Ravensbeak Forge, then the balance point is right up near the head. It's miles away from the hand. But we all know that a tomahawk is still a very effective chopping and striking implement. So, fundamentally, I don't have any problems with the Mek'leth. I think it's a pretty good design. It ties in very well with the batleth. It makes sense. Now, the final thing I want to say is, within a Star Trek context, I think it makes so much more sense than a batleth, because you can conceal it, you can wear it, you can carry it anywhere. It's short enough that it doesn't get in the way. Even in a spacesuit, I think Worf does something, essentially a spacewalk where he's outside the station, I think on DS9, and he has one sort of tucked into his belt. It's eminently practical, and in a world where phasers and various forms of essentially firearm are the principal weapons, having something that's like a big knife as a backup that you can carry anywhere without much inconvenience makes a lot more sense than something like a batleth. You can't wear a batleth. If you carry a batleth, you can't carry your firearm properly. So, batleth, to me, very much a traditional dueling, and I would, in my world building, I would say an armoured dueling weapon, a ceremonial weapon essentially for ritualistic combat. Whereas the Mek'leth, I see as a proper sidearm that still has use. I mean, let's face it, still in the world today, soldiers still carry combat knives, machetes and bayonets. So they're still a useful thing to have on your side. So the Mek'leth makes so much more sense and is a far better design of weapon for real world applications than the batleth is. I hope you've enjoyed watching that. If you massively disagree, that's fine. Get posting in the comments below. Do you agree with me? Do you think the Mek'leth is a much better weapon than the batleth for most practical purposes? In a straight up fight, do you think batleth or Mek'leth would win? Maybe that's a topic for a future video, because the batleth certainly does have some advantages over the Mek'leth, I have to admit, in a straight up fight. Thanks a lot for watching. I hope I'll see you back on the channel really, really soon. Cheers, folks. Thanks for watching. We've got extra videos on Patreon. Please give our Facebook a like and subscribe if you haven't already. Cheers, folks.